Hey guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. I'm kind of in a rush filming this one, so let's just get right on into it. Today we are going to be talking about Bonnie and Clyde, and personally I hadn't known very much about Bonnie and Clyde previously going into this. I definitely had heard people talk about them and I knew that they were a famous criminal couple. However, I just thought that they robbed banks and that was pretty much it. So it was really interesting for me to learn about Bonnie and Clyde while researching this case. Before we get too deeply into the crime stuff, I do want to talk a little bit about the background of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. So Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910 in Rona, Texas. She was the second child of 3 in her family, born to Emma and Charles Parker. When Bonnie was 4 years old, her father sadly passed away and her mother had been struggling to raise her 3 children alone, so she moved herself, Bonnie, and her 2 other children in with their grandparents in Cement City in Dallas, Texas. Something to note about this area that Bonnie had moved with her mother where her grandparents had lived was it was a really poverty-stricken area. Everybody who lived there was pretty poor and just pretty much just getting by. So once Bonnie was a little bit older, she started working as a seamstress, but she had much bigger dreams than that because ever since Bonnie was a very little girl, she always wanted to be famous. She also had a very large passion for reading and writing poetry. When Bonnie was in high school, she met a man by the name of Roy Thornton, and the two of them had this kind of like fast, speedy romance type of love. And when Bonnie was 15, she dropped out of high school and her and Roy got married. But the marriage wasn't good. Roy wasn't around very much and Bonnie was getting really fed up with this. So eventually the two decided to go their separate ways, but they never ever went through with getting a divorce. So they did technically remain married throughout both of their lives. And once the couple split, that is when Bonnie started working as a waitress in Dallas, Texas. So she was no longer working as a seamstress, she was now serving as a waitress. So now let's talk a bit about Clyde Barrow. Clyde was born on March 24th, 1909 into a poor farming family in Ellis County, Texas. He was one of 7 children, so their family was pretty big, and he was number 5. In the 1920s, Clyde's family moved to Dallas and settled in a really rundown area in Dallas. Now, Clyde's family was extremely poor. They lived in a tent, and before that, they lived underneath a wagon with absolutely nothing to any of their names. As you can probably imagine right off the bat, because his family was so poor, life for Clyde wasn't great, and he first got arrested when he was 17 years old after failing to return a rental car. A little while after this, he was then arrested again alongside his brother for having possessions of stolen turkeys. Yeah, turkeys. Imagine going to jail for stealing turkeys. But anyways, Clyde did work some jobs here and there, but throughout his entire life while he was working these jobs, he still remained being involved in crime. Something that he was really good at was wiring cars, so that was something that he continued to do throughout his entire life. Bonnie and Clyde had met when Bonnie was just 19 years old and Clyde was 20. At this time, Bonnie had just been recently fired from a job and she was now living with a friend until she was able to get back on her feet. How exactly they met is kind of mixed up all over the internet, but it does seem that the most common kind of thing is where they met, or the most believable one, I guess, would be that they were both at a mutual friend's house. Bonnie was in the kitchen doing something when Clyde walked in, and immediately sparks started flying, and it was just love at first sight. Immediately after the couple met, they started spending absolutely all of their time together, but this wouldn't last very long because Clyde was then put in prison for car theft and would serve through April of 1930s in the East Ham Prison Farm. Now again, before this, the couple was spending absolutely all of their time together, but with Clyde in prison, that was no longer possible, and Bonnie absolutely hated that. So she decided that she would help Clyde get out of prison so that the couple could go back to spending all of their time together. So in February of 1930, while Clyde was still serving time in prison, Bonnie decided to sneak Clyde a weapon that allowed him to escape from the prison. However, this wouldn't last very long. He was eventually tracked down and put back in jail. While serving the rest of his prison sentence, Clyde had actually ended up killing another man in prison. This man was really tormenting Clyde on a daily basis. He was assaulting him and just putting Clyde through absolute terror, and Clyde one day just had enough and decided to kill him. But another inmate had actually taken the blame for this because Clyde was very young at this time and the other inmate felt bad. He felt like Clyde still had his whole life ahead of him and he didn't want him to kind of rot in jail, whereas this other inmate was already old and he was already serving life in prison, so he just took the blame and said that he had killed that other man. Clyde had finished his prison sentence and was released in March of 1932. Bonnie had waited for him, so once he was out of prison, the couple just picked their relationship back up where they had left off, and Clyde got right back into committing crime. Once Clyde was released from prison and he was back with Bonnie, he then created this little group of criminals that he had known, and they continued to commit crimes similar to the ones that Clyde had been committing before he was convicted. This group of criminals began to be known as the Barrow Gang, and the members of the group did end up changing over time, but obviously Bonnie and Clyde remained the same, and Clyde was the leader of this gang. Now, this gang's main crime that they seemed to commit all the time was mainly robberies, but it is believed that they were responsible for several murders in 1932 that were mostly of police officers. Something to note here is that Clyde was very popular in the crime world, and he was able to get his hands on several things that even authorities would not be able to get their hands on at that time. He had owned better guns than even the police officers and whatnot at that time, which really gave him and his gang an advantage over authority. On April 9th of 1932, Bonnie was arrested for the first time and brought into police custody for an attempted robbery on a hardware store. Now, some people say that Bonnie had served 2 months in jail for this crime, where others say that she served no time at all. But what is absolutely 100% known for sure is that this incident did not scare Bonnie. She was not scared to get arrested, and once she was released, she returned back to her life with Clyde and their life of crime. On April 30th, 1932, the gang had planned some sort of robbery, and in this robbery, Clyde would be the getaway driver. However, during this robbery, something went completely wrong, and the owner of the store that the gang was robbing ended up being shot in the head. The group had fled the scene, but somebody had seen the gang and they reported Clyde as the murderer. Now, Clyde was not the murderer in this case. He again was just the getaway driver. Not that that really makes it any better. However, somebody did go to police saying that they had seen Clyde committing this murder, so there was a warrant out for Clyde's arrest. And he eventually was caught and he was sentenced to the electric chair, but he then escaped, and now the entire gang, Bonnie, Clyde, and all of their little gang members, were now on the run. August 5th of 1932, Clyde was visiting Oklahoma when him and one of his partners were standing outside kind of just talking and hanging out when they were approached by a deputy and a sheriff. What went on during this conversation isn't really known. However, Clyde and his associate then held open fire on both of the deputy as well as the sheriff, killing the sheriff almost instantly and leaving the deputy extremely wounded. The two people then fled the scene, Clyde and his partner, and the entire area was fled by Clyde, Bonnie, and the gang after that. Now we're jumping to March of 1933. We're really jumping all over the place here with the dates, but anyways, Clyde's brother, Buck Barrow, was released from prison at this time. Buck somehow got into contact with Clyde, and then Buck and his wife and Bonnie and Clyde started their own housekeeping business. And after they started this housekeeping business, the four of them just really started living this whole life of crime together. The four of them had to hide out because Clyde was a wanted man, and if he got caught, he would then be sentenced to death. So the four of them were kind of in a hideout kind of situation, and they lived in this apartment together, which they didn't really leave. They sat in this apartment all day, pretty much every day, just drinking and hanging out and playing cards. One day, Clyde was cleaning one of his guns, and he accidentally shot a bullet. And because this made such a loud noise, the neighbors ended up calling the police. When police arrived to see what was going on in this apartment, that is when Buck and Clyde held open fire on the officers, killing 2 policemen. Bonnie eventually joined in on the shootout, and she ended up killing a traffic control officer. The two couples then jumped into a vehicle and they completely fled the scene. Now, something to note here is that the police who were kind of showing up to the apartment knew that the people who were living in the apartment were some kind of criminals, but they had no idea that it was Bonnie and Clyde. But of course, because this escape was not planned, most of the couple's belongings were left behind in the apartment, which made it very easy for police to quickly identify who had been living there. After making this escape, that is when Bonnie and Clyde and the other couple decided that they were just going to stay on the run, traveling from state to state, robbing banks, and at this point they even started kidnapping some people. Now, something to kind of think about here, which I was really shocked by, is a lot of the hostages that were taken by Bonnie and Clyde were released, and when they were released, they said that Bonnie and Clyde actually were very, very nice to them. They treated them very well, and in some situations had even given the hostages money to kind of find their way back home and get back on their feet, which is extremely odd. Now, this next part is something that I wasn't going to include, but it seems very crazy to me, and I thought it was super interesting, so I wanted to throw it in here anyways. In July of 1930, the two couples got into another shootout with police, but this time Buck and his wife were both very badly injured. Blanche, Buck's wife, had gotten glass in her eyes during the shootout, which had caused her to go blind, and Buck had been shot in the head, and the shot was so bad that his brain was exposed. But both Buck and Blanche survived their injuries, and the two of them remained on the run. But because of these injuries and because of how severe they were, the group was slowed down a lot, and Buck and Blanche did end up getting arrested, and Buck had ended up catching a pneumonia and passing away. On January 16th, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde showed up to the prison that Clyde had previously served time at, and they started holding open fire on the prison and the prison guards, which allowed some of their friends who were inmates at this prison to escape. On April 2nd, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde killed two police officers while in Texas. These two police officers had approached the couple's car, and the couple then just shot both of the police officers. Now, both of the couple, Bonnie and Clyde, had warrants out for their arrest, and people really saw this murder as just absolutely heartless. They thought that the two of them at this point were just cold-blooded killers, whereas previously people were mad and scared of Bonnie and Clyde, but they thought for them as more as like this crime or this like system fighting couple. But now they just saw them as like heartless, cold killers. So now let's talk about May 23rd, 1934, which is the big day of the very famous takeout of Bonnie and Clyde. This took place in Louisiana, and it involved 6 police officers and 6 different law enforcement agencies. They followed Bonnie and Clyde to Louisiana after getting word about their whereabouts, and that is when they created an ambush. The officers on this case were quite literally hiding out in bushes, where they remained hiding for 24 hours until they heard Clyde's Ford V8 coming down the road. Once the car got close enough, that is when police immediately started shooting at the couple. They had fired 130 shots, killing Clyde almost instantly, and Bonnie passed away shortly after, with both of them passing away in the car. This case was just absolutely insane for me to research. Can you imagine living like that? Like, it really is like a movie, committing all of these crimes and never getting caught and living on the run and then passing away that they passed away is just, it sounds like a movie script. It doesn't sound like anybody's real life. It's crazy. But guys, that is all that I have for you on today's case. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!